And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode on the Sunday stream. It is so nice to see so many familiar names and faces in chat already pouring in, and I hope that everyone has had a good weekend so far as we move on to start our week today. So, today is going to be a little bit of just a brief overview of economic and political investment that we're going to be taking a look at in Latin and South America from the Chinese, and just sort of understand the developing relationship that is in there. And with all that in mind, let me go change the format here. Fantastic. So, hopefully, you all should still be able to hear me, but you'll get a much wider image of the presentation. So, without further ado, let's talk about what we're going to be doing today as all of you start pouring in, and give you all just a brief breakdown of what I had in mind for today's discussion/lecture. So we'll talk about a variety of Chinese investment over the last 20 years, talking about various areas of trade and commodities as well, and then talk about sort of the shifting diplomatic relations, especially over the course of the last 2.5 years with everything going on, a little bit of vaccine diplomacy as well. And then we'll move on to the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, which has been another avenue of international investment for infrastructure projects that China uses. And then, of course, talk about the Chilean election, because we briefly mentioned that over the last couple of weeks, seeing what's taken place since December 19th. And from there, we can finally move on to the bigger area of interest, which I've predicted is going to be of an area of growing importance. And I think recent news is going to kind of confirm that. But hello, everybody. I see so many people saying hi and hello. The Lonely Sir says salutations from the wage cage. I feel you. That'll be me tomorrow when everyone else starts doing streams and such. I know for Deep Lore, I'll be at work listening. So with my Frog of the Week mug in hand and a good cup of coffee, we can all get started. So these are going to be the areas that we're looking at today. And of course, an image then of then President Varela from Panama meeting with President Xi Jinping about the opening and traveling through the Panama Canal at the time, engaging, of course, in Latin and South America with trade. So that's going to be a very big area for us to take a look at today. So good afternoon to all, and let's begin. So I wanted to start with economic investment, trade, and diplomacy. I thought that these were going to be various areas of interest that sort of highlight what oftentimes gets called dollar diplomacy when we talk about sort of the global reserve currency. The other issue that we also need to keep in mind is that China more or less does the same when it comes to various aspects of investment and trade. And there was a recent report that had came out, I believe, about a year or two ago. Actually, no, 2 years ago, 2020. That was discussing just the growth of Chinese investment in this area. We often talk a lot about African investment from the Chinese, particularly in the areas of commodities trading, political, and actual hard infrastructure, roads, bridges, dams. But at the same time, China's been doing the same for quite a few decades now, or almost 20 years since they've moved into South America and Central America as well. This report had indicated, and this was from the China Center, that had said since 2005, China's own state-to-state investments within South America has exceeded both the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank since 2005. So this includes just direct Chinese funding into that area. Within the Southern American continent, its three largest economic trading partners are Brazil, Peru, and Chile, which, of course, we'll break those all down in just a little bit. But the export market, of course, has been the primary area of interest just for the sheer amount of raw materials and natural resources. So for the last 10 to 15 years, the export market has been primarily the key area for exports to China within these countries. But along with that, of course, American policy also plays a role in that in that area as well, specifically along the lines of during the Trump administration, when the trade war was beginning to heat up initially and is still actually in existence, because there's still a lot of tariffs even now in the Biden administration, which has been quite a boon for South America and its bilateral trade relations. So while at the same time that American farmers were hoarding for soybeans and corn, a lot of South American farmers and agricultural sectors had saw a significant amount of investment and trade between China as the Chinese and the Americans dealt it out over trade. And as you can tell with the image, if you can see it, if not, I'll just read some of it out to you, is that within South America, you'll see a variety of things going from commodities to a variety of agricultural things as well. But these commodities are primarily in the lines of, tobacco, various leather hides, soya, as well as sugar and pulp. But of course, some of the biggest things as well also hits along the lines of copper, various forms of zinc, iron ore, steel, all the things that you would necessarily need. And we'll get into some of the bigger aspects of minerals and mining as well, because that's one of the biggest aspects of the economic investment and trade in this region. But of course, South America and the Caribbean and what we would consider Central America has also been used as a way to look at China as the way to undercut or bypass American based sanctions. So, for example, during the Trump administration, and even to this day, China is 30% of Cuba's foreign trade alone, so almost a third in its entirety due to its friendliness, of course, both ideologically and for political purposes, because, despite the idea of easing relations during the final twilight years of the Obama administration, that soon quickly met its end during Trump's administration, and Biden has yet to really do anything on that as well when it comes to sanctions and the idea of increasing trade. So at the same time, China has been remaining one of the biggest economic trading partners in there besides Venezuela. So these are all areas in which has incurred a significant amount of Chinese economic investment, promoting trade between the two, the nation and the various states within this region, which of course has in turn put a significant amount of political capital coming from Beijing itself. So from 2000 to 2013, you can see just the amount of Latin American trade growth. It shows 27% versus, just Latin America versus global. China's been, the biggest area there. A lot of direct jobs from exports come almost half to China, almost 50-50. So all of these things illustrate a significant amount of increased economic relationships over the course since, the turn of the century. All of which puts us in a very interesting position when we talk about some of the tensions that the U.S. has looking down towards its southern backyard. But more on that in a second. But continuing on these major items of trade, because they are vital to how we look at the global economy, there's a high degree of trade and investment for lithium. So on this map here on the right, you can see through parts of Chile and Argentina as well, you have what's known as the Lithium Triangle, and I believe it goes into Colombia as well. So you have these three countries, and this major sector has some of the largest lithium deposits in the world. So this is vital for, steel manufacturing. It's vital for virtually anything that has electronics, rechargeable batteries, electric vehicles, pacemakers, medical equipment. All of these things has been one of the biggest areas of Chinese investment, which is why having a good relationship with these governments is essential. And you can see over the course of the last 5 years how that relationship has changed, but we'll get into that in just a second. But outside of just the lithium trade, the four largest commodities that these nations experience and engage in trade are soybeans, petroleum, iron, and copper. Now, of course, this doesn't come with just entirely pure benefits as well. There is significant concern. And in fact, from the Asian Pacific Journal, Joseph Tulchin wrote in July of 2019 that this amount of investment does raise concerns, both economically as well as politically. He writes that, Chinese firms have placed a significant amount of moves on energy production. State-owned Chinese consortiums have bought Peru's Chagla hydroelectric plant from the scandal-plagued and now in bankruptcy proceedings Brazilian construction firms, while the State Grid Corporation of China continues to purchase Brazilian energy companies. And there's also been significant increases in foreign direct investment into those countries as well. But he also writes that economists and government officials in various parts of South American countries are worried about this new paradigm, what he calls the new dependence on China. The only nation right now, at least as of 2019, when this article was published, only the nation of Ecuador has been able to reduce its economic dependence on China. Whereas China's trade with Latin America, of course, is focused on mining. It's like over 25% of the region's extractive exports. Then it's roughly 20% when it comes to agricultural exports, but manufacturing is only like less than 5%. So there's significant issues on how that relationship has been maintained, especially because you're not necessarily building manufacturing centers there. You're extracting resources. It's very much a relationship back and forth between the natural being, extracted and exported to China versus the prefabricated, pre-manufactured goods in China coming there as well. So, all of which is something that's going to play a major role there. But let's see. Check out on chat. King of Games asks if I'm a Nescafe Gold enjoyer. I am not. I'm not a fan of most instant coffee. And the only reason why I say that I'm not a fan of most instant coffee is because there was this law office I worked at where he was only adamant about having instant coffee. And it was just the worst thing I had ever had. So, yeah, no, I'm not. Neither at work or at home. No, as much as the meme goes on. But yeah, so with that being said, this allows us to kind of just take a look at just how much money and how much dollars just flow into the country and flow out of China, but also in these investments that are in there. So these multilateral agreements and trade are going to play a role in diplomacy to get these countries on board for, say, joining on to the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as receiving funds for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. They've gained more involvement in the region, but there are, two main areas in which they put a lot of focus on in these investments. Particularly because you have Venezuela, which of course has its own issues, but Venezuela is an area that has received significant amount of Chinese loans and investment, in part to keep up the National Petroleum Company, which I think is just abbreviated as like the PDVSA. I couldn't tell you what that is in Spanish, but they're trying to increase production. That way it's back to, pre-Nicolas Maduro levels back when Hugo Chavez was just beginning to take power, because the capacity for production in Venezuela, Tolchin writes that in 2018, it was a third of what it was in the late 1990s. So they're trying their best in order to make sure that petroleum can be used from Venezuela to get access to China, which can then be sent to Russia. That way, all these other buyers can be maintained. So the other issue there exists within that region, of course, is the problem of, well, some of these countries are near bankruptcy. They have significantly high debt to GDP ratios, especially with other investment banks, all of which illustrates a problem there, right? For how on earth you can keep these companies and countries afloat without total state or regulatory capture. So these are things that we'll definitely be taking a look at. Mr. 420 provides $6.99 Canadian US. Thank you so much. He says, has some shekels prude. I'm going to watch this after my hike today. Well, thank you so much. Enjoy your hike. It's comments like that mean so much to me, because when people say that they listen after a hike or after going to the gym, you guys make my day. But yeah, so all of these economic moves, significant amount of investments, there's already the ongoing political concern about being too heavily economically dependent, but at the same time, that interdependency illustrates just how much it keeps some of these most vibrant industries alive, especially in Argentina, especially in Chile, and even more so, providing diplomatic pressure on other countries like that of Brazil. And we'll, again, get more into that in just a bit. But this allows us to sort of start taking a look at how trade and vaccine diplomacy sort of provides a looming shadow over some of the greater geopolitical issues that we often hear get talked about in the news. And of course, one of those being that of the recognition over Taiwan, because it does sort of hit the brakes on some projects that the Chinese would like to accomplish, particularly in the expansion of Belt and Road, and as well as sort of the position about creating sort of a trans, South American railroad, where they want to just start putting it out. I think it's connecting the Brazil's Atlantic coast to the Peruvian Pacific coast. And this was discussed years ago, I want to say initially around 2014, 2013. But of course, diplomatically, it does raise some issues when certain nations recognize, and of course, these are Central American nations, but there are those in South America that have a similar problem. That of Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Paraguay all recognize Taiwan to some diplomatic extent, either by full recognition of statehood or providing a diplomatic line of communication. However, these various projects that China wishes to engage in The diplomatic tension between the United States, putting pressure over there, the Organization of American States, which we'll talk about in a minute. Taiwan can only do so much, and so can American pressure, particularly when you're taking a look at state-operated enterprises, and not to mention China's own foreign aid budget, which significantly dwarfs that of what the Americans can give or what the Americans invest, as well as what Taiwan's own foreign aid budget is. So I believe in 2020, the budget for foreign aid was about $320 million US from Taiwan versus what the Chinese could put out, which was $6 billion. But on top of that, this has been allowing the recent issues over the last 2 years to put out significant arguments or significant pressure to get what China wants because of the ability to offer sort of a non-American or a non-European medical remedy or inoculation to what we're currently seeing over the last 2 years. So, as you can tell right there, these were some soccer players just from about a year, last year, at the beginning of the year, that were offering, of course, advertisements for the Sinovac vaccine, which is, of course, China's coronavirus vaccine, in order to, gain more, gain a stronger position within their own South American holdings. For instance, during the time where the United States was pressuring allies to push back against allowing Huawei 5G infrastructure to be built within their countries, the United States had probably the two largest partners that were in there was, of course, the United Kingdom and that of Brazil. However, during this negotiation for purchasing doses of the Sinovac vaccine from China and how much they could get available to them, some of the biggest things that Brazil managed to do under President Bolsonaro was to reverse the Huawei ban and to have Chinese infrastructure investment, being brought into the Brazilian country. So, and some consider it less effective, or some consider it safer. All of which, puts it in a position for China to use it as political leverage and diplomatic leverage over these various states. All of these things are things that truly do matter. And it's a way for them to, of course, maintain their investment. But let's see here. Blackwater Park says, he's just referencing another conversation. Isn't Venezuela's oil more expensive to access than like the Americans or the Saudi oil? I was thinking that was part of their problem. The one thing that I did read when I was prepping for this about how much investment they're putting in is that they're trying to, you have issues of aging equipment due to American sanctions. You do have various owners that work within the PDVSA that, of course, are direct recipients of American sanctions, like called out individually, but also because lack of equipment that's aging, things that are making it difficult. So you have both a leadership issue, but also a technical problem, and which it prevents them from getting a lot of oil. That was how it was understood to me when I was prepping for today. But if it is harder to get a hold of, either due to geography, that wouldn't surprise me either. But I do know that Venezuela has some of the largest oil reserves on Earth, which makes them, of course, a very tempting partner to make with economically, regardless of governments, which, while the United States has made its ideological position known, the Chinese and the Russians have no problem engaging with trade, neither do the Cubans, and so on. But the last 2 years, especially with what's happened with the current ongoing crisis, is also that this has allowed China to sort of amend its own economic position as well. Traditionally, as Tolchin writes, that China's not made its investments or loans conditional on political stances or macroeconomic policies. Its position is contrasted sharply with that of multinational agencies, which puts numerous fiscal and budgetary conditions on the loans that they offer, whereas the U.S. frequently pushes for political changes. However, in places like Venezuela, China's approach appears to have gotten its banks and investors in serious trouble. In Ecuador, it's also created problems where the government has changed and accused previous officials from taking bribes from the Chinese for these infrastructure deals. These projects are now on hold while the current government deals with it, carries out its investigations. And that kind of thing also happened in another part of South Central America, was the issue over the price tag. For example, when the proposed railway was being suggested, Peru was very much skeptical over the price tag and had dealt with some investigations of infrastructure officials, particularly Interior Ministry officials, over the concerns of taking Chinese bribes. In 2016, Peru's government very much balked at the idea that this was going to cost them $60 billion. And for, over half of that would be something that Peru would have to put a leg for. And it was about $35 billion. So There were ongoing talks to sort of bring it back, but these ambitious projects do run into the issue of where are you going to invest, and where are you going to start putting your money in? And of course, it's primarily going through just Brazil to Peru, but the idea of having these projects put on hold due to the price tag and the allegations of corruption do come in mind. But when so many of these countries are economically interdependent on one another, especially in exports, and you already have these countries changing their position on vaccine diplomacy, then why not? Um, yeah, no, they did ban the big Huawei 99 Iron Duke. It was the Brazilians that had reversed to their position. Um, But yeah, so all of these things sort of put the looming shadow over the fact that you can allow yourself to put more pressure on Taiwan, which because, there's only about 14 states plus the Holy See that are United Nations recognized states that recognize Taiwan as a state. Not even the United States does either. It does allow the Chinese to make a significant argument on the world stage that there's little recognition. There's been historical ties to the island, that reunification is within, the best interest in order to avoid war. And of course, South America, using its economic interdependence, has allowed the same thing to happen, while at the same time getting access to vaccine diplomacy. But one of the things that we did talk about a couple weeks ago, and that we sort of, theory crafted on Twitter, was the idea of what would happen now that the Chilean election had passed on December 19th, and Mr. Gabriel Boric is the president elect. I don't know if he's actually taken office yet. I should probably confirm that. But Mr. Boric, of course, is of Croatian descent, and he has said quite a few things over his young life that has put him, as a very progressive, openly leftist candidate. In fact, even Jacobin magazine put an article out, I think today or yesterday, that had said that because of where he comes from in terms of his descent, he was a very big advocate for, and he's a believer in Yugoslavian communism. Um, the way that it was ran, the way that it was functioned. He considers himself an anti-neoliberal, and he's sort of using this in a position towards using it as a position towards to change how much trade and exploitation has happened. And at the same time that all of this is going on, the Chinese are expecting that the relationship between the two countries is not going to change as much. There was an interview discussion about this happening between some of the largest investors that happened to be inside there. This was a Q&A from BNA or BN Americas on December 29th, so literally 10 days after the election. So they were curious as to what this would mean for Chinese investments, particularly because at the current point in time, the issues that were being raised over the same old politics in Chile was that a majority of women turned out for this election. They had supported Boric and the idea of having greater economic reforms. Despite the fact that the economy has improved over the last 30 years, there's still various issues of economic income and disparities. Something that it ranges around where about 11% of the country still lives in some form of extreme poverty, something that they wish to deal with, while at the same time, it was projected that the nation would face significant economic slowdown in 2022, despite for a good chunk of the country reaching sort of that middle income aspect when we talk about, economic development. Of course, Gabriel Boric is a 35-year-old leftist, childless, considers himself a progressive and an anti-neoliberal. He was the candidate of the leftist, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce this, but it was a sort of a movement that he's been around for a while with. He was a student activist, then becoming a minister and working within the government, and ran for office and successfully had defeated the right of center candidate, regardless of various claims of either interference or mail issues. The outgoing president has accepted the results and has stepped down. But from this interview, they had a conversation with Carlos Salazar, a commercial engineer and works from Shanghai University. He says served as an advisor to state-owned operated Chinese companies in Chile, and what entrepreneurs from various Asian countries can expect from the next government. And this interview is quite revealing, as they've talked about diversifying their investments in the region. They've talked about the argument over the fact that they want to start looking into renewables, they want to start looking at hydrogen, they want to start looking at solar, things that, they should be looking at, especially because this president wants to address climate change head on, front and center. So he says that you should expect Chinese companies to start taking a look at green hydrogen, photovoltaic and wind power plants. But at the same time, transportation infrastructure will also be a significant area of investment as well. In fact, during the first half of 2021, Chinese investments in Chile increased substantially. It was about a 28% increase compared to 2020. So about $24 billion invested in 2021 versus the $18 billion invested in 2020. And of course, a lot of this investment has been oriented around agriculture and infrastructure. But as I have up here on the slide, that of course there's this issue of the Constitutional Convention. So the Constitutional Convention that existed was that there was a referendum, I believe in 2020, that said that they would like to rewrite the current Chilean constitution, which of course the current Chilean constitution was written, of course, and installed by Augusto Pinochet, and had been in place ever since. And so, via referendum, they opted to change that constitution and put forward new reforms. And in fact, this has already taken place because some of the convention and its leadership was supposed to take place on January 4th, and that's already happened. So, the Constitutional Convention, as the New York Times discusses, is that they are putting the issue of climate and its own domestic, agriculture first and foremost before anything else. So this was updated on January 6th, 2022, writing the following here. So after months of protests over social and environmental grievances, 155 Chileans have been elected to write a new constitution amid what they have declared a climate and ecological emergency. And they say that there are a variety of issues that they would like to address, particularly that mining companies in Chile, the world's second largest lithium producer after Australia, which is something to keep in mind because, of course, when we take a look at spheres of influence, where is it that these countries find themselves aligned? If the world's largest producer and exporter for lithium happens to be within the realm of the American or Western influence, like that of Australia, you naturally have to pursue one of your own, especially as there's been more adamant positionings, whether it's the AUKUS deal, engaging in Quad talks about strategic ways to respond to China in the South China Sea, all of which emphasizes that China finds itself trying to find ways out of this policy of containment. And if you're familiar with sort of your history of American diplomats, the policy of containment really originates from George Kennan. And after the Soviet Union fell, Kennan, during the last years of his life, was adamantly against expansion eastward, arguing that this policy of containment, now that the USSR has failed, is only going to push the United States into a war with Russia. And of course, keep in mind, it's been well documented that at no point in time was there economic or military parity between these two countries, the Soviet Union and the United States. And now you're at a position where that's very well possible. All of which, right, this kind of puts Chile in the forefront of how does its own constitutional, amendments, its own new legal system, how is that going to play a role in the ability for China to secure its own strategic needs? And we'll get that into a second. But Monothalmos had sent for €5. Thank you so much. He says the secret ingredient to Yugoslavian communism was Western loans. The country descended into ethnic civil war once they actually had to repay it. I mean, Western loans and Western development definitely played a role in keeping Yugoslavia afloat, especially as things kind of started falling apart post-Soviet Union. But yeah, there's always economic pressure that happens and can also descend into government corruption and coups, as we've noticed throughout, post-1990 or post-Soviet Union Africa when it comes to various forms of American USAID and IMF diplomacy, because as Tolchin had mentioned earlier in that article, that traditionally those comes with very strict conditions in order to get the loan, whereas China has been a little more flexible, both legally speaking and politically, when it comes to things such as that. But yeah, Uncle Thomas says here, Boric is a Redditor. Probably. I guarantee you that he probably has a Reddit account, and if I don't really peruse the site. So, but I believe that he probably is. He's 35 years old and a leftist, so probably. But let's see. Let's continue. But someone else asked, yo, isn't Afghanistan trying to sign an economic deal with China? That would be an alliance made in hell. So, I believe Afghanistan now calls itself the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and the leadership that is there has said that yes, they are open to Chinese cooperation, they are open to Chinese security, and they are open to the issue of engaging in Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure projects. I think we've discussed this previously on the Sunday stream. I know that Semyagog and I have talked about it when it comes to Afghanistan on his channel. And that was something that we definitely liked to think about because there's a lot of terrorism technically within the Wakhan corridor, which connects Afghanistan to China's Xinjiang province. You have various Uyghur, Islamic movements there. You have Turkmenistan Islamic movements there that aren't necessarily aligned with the the Taliban and their goals to now govern the country. So it is crazy, but it also plays well into the role of the fact that places like China are wishing to connect via infrastructure to get access to vital trade routes that sort of geographically bypass American spheres of influence, or at least puts their foot in the door in there. Because what a better way to connect China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and then get yourself into Iran, where you can bypass Saudi Arabia to get to the Gulf Coast and to get access to oil reserves. So all of these things in mind are going to play a huge role in the future. And if you're interested in hearing more of my thoughts there, Semyagog, and I did a stream with him on his channel on Afghanistan as well. So things to definitely consider. But no, it's a good question. Would it be an alliance made in hell? Potentially. But I think that the Chinese probably don't mind making a few backroom deals to make it work. And not to mention, throughout the entire time of American occupation, the Taliban had used the Chinese as sort of a leveraging and bargaining tool to get, more, I guess, what you would call, things to agreement, more compromises with the Americans and her allies at the negotiating table. So, yeah, I mean, potentially an alliance made in hell, but it's not like they've worked together in the past. But yeah. But all that being said, let's get ourselves back to Chile and of course the focus here in South and Latin America. So back to that New York Times article that we were discussing, because its constitutional convention had a variety of issues that were being discussed. The issues about deforestation. They said Christina Dorador Ortiz, a microbiologist, who was in the Constitutional Convention, had wrote and said to the New York Times, "We have to assume that human activity causes damage. So how much damage do we really want to cause? What is enough damage to live well?" And then, of course, the other issue is about things such as water access, underground water, all of these things here. They're trying to replace the 1980 Constitution written by Pinochet. So, with all that in mind and the new leadership that's been in place, there are various areas where they're concerned about not only just the economic damage, but also how much do they want to deal with in relations to other countries. Because lithium is still a bull market, and I believe their own companies are, I think it's called SQM. Yeah, it's a state-owned market maker of fertilizer that was, that Pinochet turned over to his son-in-law. And then, of course, it's been more recently fined by the Chile stock market regulator as well as the U.S. Security Exchange Commission after, corrupt for under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. But it still has some issues about ownership. But SQM still exists. The vice president, Carlos Diaz, said the lithium company is increasing how much it puts out from 140,000 tons of lithium carbonate to 180,000 tons by 2022. So this marketplace is still a significant area of interest. But the focus on environments by the Constitutional Convention may put a hamper on, the amount that China gets out of its lithium resources. But again, like we mentioned, and someone had kind of put it perfectly in the chat, that he's very much a Redditor. He's open to supporting universal health care. He wants people to have the capacity to withdraw more out of their pensions. And at the same time, he's also said things that you would hear out of sort of an American leftist, or really what we would call any sort of like global citizen thinking person, about saying that, the problem with Chile, he tweeted a few years back, is that there's too many Chileans. So all of these things are curious to see as this government begins to form. However, there also may be pushback, even though there's more of an ecological focus out of this Constitutional Convention. and this new governing document, the actual legislature is split between the various parties. So Boric, while coming into office, does not have the same level of control as, say, Obama does in 2009 with a supermajority in both houses. It's completely different. So this may still maintain it. And in fact, referring back to the Salazar interview with BN Americas, they were arguing that they do expect that the relationship between the two countries will stay the same. It's very clear that they will try and seek to approach and engage in a climate of understanding and well-being. It's important to emphasize that for China, as an international leadership role for Chile is interesting. In relations between Latin America and Asia, China values Chile's presence in world markets and is actively a promoter of economic, financial, and technological commercial relations. So Salazar continues and says that they'll respect the process, and we will probably amend ourselves to whatever happens, which I think it puts it all into a very interesting position as the Constitutional Convention has sort of been more or less reaching its wrap up, where they're talking about a variety of things about the ecological issues, the discussion over various kinds of rights, whether it's about abortion, whether it's about indigenous rights, all of these things have it there. But the various problems that do exist has been the problems over that there's an overwhelming presence of university professors, scientists, and so on, all of which is trying to put the focus on the fact that, hey, the environment is the first and foremost problem. So this may put a hamper as the government now continues to get a rein on what it wants to do and engage in these relationships between these two countries. All of which I think will put us in a very interesting position in the near future. But that's just within Chile, and this government is it's beginning to take form. It's something that we should follow up on in a future stream, I think, especially because this is basically your average our Chapo, trap house poster, who is now elected to the government in Chile. So I think that this will definitely be something that we can look at in a future stream. But that's currently what's happening. There are concerns over lithium extraction, the environment, and its government. But the problem at the same time is the issue of, okay, if you want to try and reverse economic downturn, but you also want to focus on your own ecological issues, where will the balance be between taking on more Chinese loans and taking on more Chinese investment in order to prop up these projects, while at the same time trying not to necessarily restrict them to what you need? This is going to be a concern that I know Boric will have to face, especially with his government being so divided, at least in the legislature. So these are things that we will definitely keep our thumb on and make sure that we have or at least a finger on the pulse, so to speak, and we'll definitely be following this in the future. But Sunos Hamar says in chat, Croatian import man wants to implement failed socialist experiment from his homeland. The Chileans are genius. Well, I mean, keep in mind that when we talk about the wonders of democracy, keep in mind, just remember that there is no such thing as the wisdom of the masses. But now this kind of gets to the thing that I've talked about last week and that I've talked about when we talked about the Mexican president stream with one of my patrons who had offered quite a bit of history on American-Mexican relations. And this is about CELAC and China, which I think in this year, as well as for many years to come, especially as they're going to be more sort of direct challenges, is this multipolar world that develops, challenging American unipolarity, is that strong economic and political blocs with similar ideological alignment will play a major role in the future between various nation states and great powers. So CELAC stands for the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. Now, this is a relatively newer organization compared to the OAS, which is the Organization of American States, which includes North America, all of Latin America, the Caribbean, and South America. But the OAS being around since the end of the Second World War and as a way to sort of promote trade, communication, integration, economically and diplomatically, it's always been contrasted to the idea of Yankee imperialism or American involvement in Central and South America. And of course, there's reason to do that because, from the 1890s to the 1930s, there were massive amounts of American interventionism within Central and South America, as well as the Caribbean. numerous areas that, of course, really sort of emerge out of the Spanish-American War and a more aggressive application of the Monroe Doctrine. But CELAC, however, of course, is more left-oriented politically. Of course, President Obrador from Mexico has been very adamant that it takes a much larger role in Central Caribbean and South American political leadership, saying that CELAC could be used as the formulation of some kind of European Union-style organization for Central and Southern American states as a way for greater economic cooperation, a greater understanding of unique and cultural ideals, considering that they don't have the same sort of, at least, originally, ethnogenesis to say the United States or that of Canada, where it was primarily European. It was primarily what we would call like white European or Anglo or French or Dutch, whereas it's primarily Spanish from pretty much Mexico down on southward. And in turn, this provides a very interesting contrast for how China sees this rather left-leaning anti-American bloc and promotes more of a regional, cultural, and ethnic independence from the long looming shadow of American involvement in Central and South America, especially during the Cold War. I mean, we can talk about Allende some other time. I think that's a very interesting case study about, the removal of leadership. But I mean, that's something for another time. But with this being minded, China definitely sees CELAC to be an area of significant strategic and political interest in the region as well. So things to definitely keep in mind. And the document I have below was from a recent meeting between various members of the community of Latin American and Caribbean states with the Chinese Foreign Ministry. And there's a lot to break down here, but I just do have this image here because they've announced a key strategic joint action plan for cooperation in key areas. And I wanted to read a little bit of that to you all, so I think that you can understand just some of the things that are being discussed. The first one is about political and security cooperation. Strengthens high-level contacts and meetings between leaders and representatives of both parties in a multilateral forum and other forms of exchange to expand contacts in different levels to share governance and public administration experience to a greater extent. So trying to incorporate in greater areas. But there is also a lot of focus as well on other international conventions. Point 4 within this listing says, in accordance with respective domestic laws of each country, they will agree to strengthen dialogue and cooperation against all manifestations of transnational organized crime, illicit arms trafficking, illicit financial flows, and address the illicit production and trafficking of narcotic, drugs, and psychotropic substances. So, for those of you who are kind of familiar between what's kind of happened in the United States over the last several years, has been whether it's Fast and Furious, this idea of tackling them, a lot of American funding that inadvertently goes to Mexico to deal with, say, cartels and various other trafficking groups for security, contrasts significantly with the issue of what actually happens, or say what the EU proposes. So the idea of, securitization, promoting a stronger war on drugs policy, you can debate it as much as you'd like, but we can definitely tell that it's not like the American policy has been working, both either to keep things certainly weaker and down below, whereas something that which AMLO has called out in the recent years, but the other issue, of course, being that places like the European Union's own human rights affairs issues, when they were trying to deal with Colombia and the revolutionary forces of Colombia, also known as the FARC. Their idea of proposed policy was that of alternative crop development. So using financial payments, microcredit financing, and international loans that put it out to incentivize non-illicit crop development, while at the same time proposing actual disarmament. So you can sort of see these two varying camps, and now China wants to get involved in this as well, because of course, when it comes to terrorism, arms, illicit drugs, and the trafficking of said drugs, arms, materials, and human beings, it's not just that you're going to be dealing with organized crime. Of course, that exists. I'm not doubting that. I'm not saying that it doesn't. But the other area, of course, being involved, and we can definitely look at the United States as a clear example of this, is that it's a really good way for governments to get involved in various clandestine activities, use it as diplomatic and strategic back channels with other countries and various organizations, all of which, puts it in a very interesting position for now China to get involved. So you're now seeing a sort of what will, I think, emerge out of the strategic plan is now a very three-pronged or a three-front difference in policy and engagement. Because now the Chinese want to get involved in greater security operations against illicit drugs and trafficking. The United States, of course, has been providing foreign aid for the purposes of trafficking and drugs. And now at the same time, the European Union has been offering more of a diplomatic solution, offering talks and providing funds for things like that of alternative crop development, getting these organizations to seat at the table, and trying to create political organizations, but not necessarily ones that are armed. And I think that we can kind of see that what the EU has been proposing has not necessarily worked to an extent. The ceasefire with FARC has not necessarily held up very well. The idea of engaging them as a political party has not worked. And of course, trafficking with drugs has not decreased in the slightest. But this action plan continues in other areas as well. Expanding bilateral and multilateral cooperation against various forms of corruption, tax evasion, and illicit financial flows. But the one that I think is the most interesting is the continue to hold the China Latin American Superior Defense Forum on a voluntary participation basis. This is something that has been discussed quite a bit because China and the CLAC organizations typically do not discuss the realms and concerns of international defense or international pressure to put, arms or Chinese exercises there, which is now beginning to change because this discussion over security is now right there front and center with what, the United States is worried about. And in fact, from the national interest, this is something that the United States needs to start taking a look at. Nicaragua has recently decided to engage in ongoing relationships with China, sort of taking back its diplomatic recognition of Taiwan and established a relationship with that of the Chinese. This happened on December 18th. And this, again, all plays an interesting role in the aspect of defense and areas of influence. And all of this, in my time researching this and preparing this conversation, has been the discussion that then Secretary of State John Kerry had said during the twilight hours of the Obama administration, saying that areas like the Monroe Doctrine were, ancient history and old news. I can remember that coming out of John Kerry's mouth. I can remember, of course, the JCPOA, the P5+1 agreement with Iran, and then he gave this weird speech, I think in Germany, I think it was in Frankfurt, where he said that in the United States you have the right to be stupid. So those are the three things I remember from John Kerry. It's just a little aside there. But with that being said, it does come into an interesting position where now the United States, in this sort of abandonment of the Monroe Doctrine, this abandonment of engagement and providing more of a stricter immigration policy out of Trump, to where now there's a recognition that, there needs to be greater cooperation, there needs to be greater engagement, all of which puts it in now a very unique position for China to start pursuing its own interests as well. So, we can continue on with this national interest article because I think there's quite a bit there for us to discuss because, not only are we dealing with the Taiwanese issue being addressed, as we mentioned, via vaccine diplomacy, but also because, China has begun to extend its Belt and Road Initiative. This CLAC agreement has also talked about security. So, of the various countries that have signed up for the Belt and Road Initiative, here are just a few to name them: Chile, Peru, Costa Rica, Panama, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Antigua, and Barbuda. All of these nations have signed on to it. But at the same time, as the article continues, China has also been quite willing to sell military hardware and high-tech surveillance systems to Latin American and Caribbean governments, run disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda operations against the United States and its allies in the region. Now, keep in mind, this is from the national interest, and this is calling for America to change its grand strategy in this region. But there's still some things in here in the reports and the links that we can definitely talk about. So within this, the narrative is that China is a stronger economic partner, has a very successful development model, state-owned enterprises and state capitalism to invest in with regional development. This is meant to paint a sharp contrast to the United States, which state-owned publications like the Global Times, China's state-owned newspaper, stress that the United States is not reliable to invest in the region. Not to mention there's a long history of American investment being in there, being used for other purposes. Not to mention that, because of how vaccine diplomacy and what's happened with COVID over the last 2 years has been that China's own reporting systems, which you should take with a grain of salt, they use to propagate to the rest of the world, saying that we've had the solution. We're offering you our own inoculation. By all means, come and support us. We'll engage in trade. All that we're asking you to do is to reduce your diplomatic relationships with Taiwan. So as we've talked about it in the past, in the last couple of streams about great power politics and what's to come in 2022, we're already seeing this trend kind of come to culmination that we've seen for now the last 15 to 20 years, significant investment in the region. We're now beginning to transfer our conversation from economic and political to now strategic. Whether it's the conversations in CELAC about multilateral, defense forums on a voluntary participation basis, and of course, working in the realm of how on earth we can work together. And it doesn't just exist in, of course, the idea of just security. It also works about, strengthening technological innovation, particularly in the areas of cyberspace. All of these areas are being focused on, as well as the creation of something that they had said out of the foreign ministry, strengthening exchanges and cooperation for the civilian use of nuclear energy technology and promote relevant practical projects, experience sharing and cooperation and talent training, and be willing to offer these advantages to nuclear technology and energy and promoting economic development and people's well-being. Even if it is for the purpose, right, of just, these strategic changes, to have economic development, greater investment in the area. All of these things, of course, are going to raise some eyebrows from the current regime that we see in the United States. But let's see here. Let's see. King of Game says the way to deal with the cartel is the usage of certain discharges to kill crops and prevent further growth. And well, the question, right, that you would do that is that it raises the age-old question, King of Games. I'll leave your comment up for a second. The age-old question of dealing with cartels is that you would need the permission, right, of the state government to do so. If you're at least going to treat the state as a legitimate one and not declare it as some sort of failed state. So this is sort of the same kind of problem that you had during the 2011 raid, diplomatically speaking, in Pakistan, which killed Osama bin Laden. Is that this was not done without consultation to the Pakistani government because they had concerns that Pakistan was purposefully shielding him and hiding him there and granting him some kind of asylum. He had a large complex right outside in Abbottabad, which had a military academy, so of course. But at the same time, after the royal raid was completed, it had this really awkward position. And the position was, do we, announce that we didn't know that they were there, thus admitting to our enemies, i.e. India, that we didn't have the capacity to detect, a couple of Black Hawk modified helicopters that came in and did this raid? Or B, do we acknowledge that some sort of consultation took place or that we were at least remotely aware of it and we just let it happen, which indicates weakness, especially because it was right next to a military academy and right next to military resources. So it puts it in a double bind. So say, for instance, if you wanted to go after cartels, and I think this is actually a really good conversation for a future stream, but if you wanted to go after them, do you consult with them, the government, or do you do it clandestinely and try to engage in that? And I'm not familiar enough with the current American policy to know, are we doing anything similar to that? But I mean, at the same time, the potential environmental damage, right, for defoliants or some kind of harm for crops, we don't know what the long-term consequences of that could be, and that could cause significant diplomatic and economic ramifications decades down the line. So all sorts of things that we would have to keep in mind. But yeah. Okay, coffee's done. We can continue on. But the other areas, right, is that out of this CLAC discussion has been the question of, security and technology. So, for instance, in regards to agriculture, they've been talking about how to increase food security, but they've also been talking about how to increase, national security on the grounds for things like poaching, environmental destruction, crop theft, road issues, various holdups, and things like that. Providing technology for things like crop dusting, which includes drones as well. So all of these things illustrate that it doesn't necessarily require hard power. And I don't think that it requires you to have it. And this shows sort of the other side of soft power as well. Is one of the things that I've observed in the last few years is that I do think that when it comes to, like, say, the United States, right, you have the issue over, is the United States is a hard power country fighting, at least right now, a soft power conflict. Because as you can see with, say, Russia and Germany over the issue of Nord Stream 2, or the various Belt and Road initiatives that are being put out, along with its own kind of monetary imperialism with China, the United States is sort of projecting itself through its military, through its strategic alliances and relationships, in a way that it doesn't have the ability to offer on the other side, because America's primarily, we're not as industrial as we used to be. A lot of our stuff, of course, comes out of the deindustrialization, out of, sort of our liberalization of trade, what often gets lauded as neoliberalism in the United States. While at the same time, we're a very oriented consumer culture. And we, economically put the WTO up to have China's permanent First Nation status. But I mean, the question becomes, what do you want? Is the cultural aspect to it, which you got that god awful, I think it was the Newsweek opinion section about how wokeness will rule the world. And we do have American culture, and we do have our movies, and we do have our English, and we do have our internet lingo virtually everywhere around the world. But at the same time, you have technological assistance, you have expertise, you have these two rivaling visions. And it comes down to the perception of which these countries have. And it's not to say that the United States doesn't have soft power. Lord knows that we do. But the question becomes, does the soft power and the arguments over, say, gay and human rights and things like that, does that work when, how much is that worth in terms of, say, skyrocketing energy prices during the winter? How much is that worth when you're trying to strategically pressure and use said, soft power, economic energy and power to stop, getting something access that's cheaper, and things like that. So that's what makes, I think, South America such an interesting part of the global sphere of great power politics, is because while you're engaging with this, a left-leaning organization that is promoting greater solidarity between, say, Spanish and Portuguese-speaking countries, that also respects indigenous rights, that also wishes to focus on the environment, which also has a lot of things that are culturally similar, either via ethnicity or simply by a common background with one another, and is advocating for some sort of unification, almost Bolivarian in a way. It gives China a very unique way to put itself out there as the American alternative, especially because it doesn't take just, Hugo Chavez or Nicolas Maduro yelling Yankee imperialism. It's not like they're the only country that's been affected by this. It does put things into a very interesting conversation. But yeah. Let's see. Tom Nguyen asked another question. Well, I'll get to the end of the lecture in just a second here, guys. He says, I know that you've spoken against containment, but what if NATO sways Russia to their side? Would you support containment as an optimal solution? My optimal solution would have been, and this, so I've sort of got two takes on this. The optimal solution wouldn't have been to move eastward. It would have been to increase economic investment, to try and prop Russia up, prop up the former Soviet republics, and in turn try and engage in them in a sort of economic, political, and strategic way to foster, integration without disrespecting cultural and ethnic values in the area. Because what we have seen via this integration has just been, ethnic tensions. We can see this in Ukraine. We can see this in Belarus, to where now, Russia feels very contained and does feel threats to national security. And in fact, we're kind of beginning to see the concerns over the Caribbean crisis, because Sergei Lavrov earlier this week had mentioned the idea of, using Cuba or other parts in Latin America as potential military bases. So the optimal solution, I do think, would have been rapprochement. I do think that that's possible, but unfortunately, we're dead set, diehard, determined to admit nations like Ukraine into NATO, which only escalates the situation. What if NATO sways? Yeah, exactly. But all of these things are various issues why I think that the CLAC is going to be something that happens in the future, to a great degree of importance. And within that, right, you also have the issue of this divergence politically over, where they side with on the United States on the Taiwan issue, where they side with the Chinese on this issue as well. So, for instance, this idea of the divergence, right, is about these diplomatic bridges and is open to engaging in trade. And of course, there's, arguments from the United States that they've used the pandemic as a way to improve their, relationship and their standing in South America, all of which now puts them in a position that allows China to look better than just, the claims of, you're doing this to improve your position. China, for its part, Zhao Lijian, the foreign ministry spokesman, says that all of these deals are humanitarian oriented. The virus can spread across borders, but mankind's love also transcends borders. He said this last spring in 2021. And by engaging with CELAC and continuing these conversations, it's on, investment, aerospace, aeronautics, and aviation, increased energy cooperation and energy saving, carbon capture, and creating carbon-oriented markets like carbon credits, and to strengthen cooperation for technical capacities. Now, the one thing that you could probably highlight as an issue would be that, is it going to be localized, or is it going to be sort of bringing the Chinese over to share this information and keep it primarily within Chinese hands? When we talked about the issue of Kazakhstan, one thing that Eurasian, or at least Eurasian-oriented countries like Kyrgyzstan, like Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan have managed to get out of Chinese investment was localization, talent that can put countries, with their local, citizens, their own national citizens, to know these skills and to put it out there. So that'll be something that we'll have to see in the future as time goes on. But if I were to offer my final thoughts as we get closer to the respective end of our lecture today, before we just get all over the place, is that we have seen already, over 20 years of investment within the region, and that investment is only going to continue. And we are now going to start seeing it not just on economic ends, but we're also going to start seeing it as well on grounds of strategic interests, resource extraction. And they're also going to start using, in my opinion, the idea of, green energy or climate change that we often see out of Western rhetoric. And they're going to start using it for themselves in South America, as well as within their own backyard. So keep in mind that, in order to meet these like COP26 agreements that China signed on to, rather than say pursuing geothermals, rather than saying pursuing out the arguments for various forms of solar energy, or just doing it purely that way, or hydroelectric, China is also pursuing nuclear. They're willing to put in, billions of dollars into shutting down their coal-fired reactor plants and setting up various forms of nuclear-powered reactors in order to keep China's energy needs met, and to be met for a very lengthy period of time. And so, in this discussion over photovoltaic, carbon capture, and nuclear, China is beginning to use climate change diplomacy the same way that the United States has done, the same way that European nations have done, but do it to secure its own actual economic interests. Whereas in the West, we often criticize climate change policy to be, not including nuclear, not including the things that actually work or have the potential to work. For instance, my hot take is that I think out of all of these sort of alternative energies, outside of fossil fuel, I do think that geothermal is something that probably should get more research and interests in. That's my hot take for that issue. But the fact that these things are not including nuclear in the West does limit the energy needs and production for our own interests if they ever wanted to actually transition away. And they're not even using American skills like oil and liquid natural gas extraction, or shale gas extraction with fracking and so on, and pipeline drilling, and nations that do have oil reserves, right? Things like that in African nations that do want, actual, resource extraction based economies, or that would need fossil fuels to industrialize. And that would be an interesting way for Americans to engage in diplomacy in Africa. But instead, what we're seeing is that we're going to be seeing rather the self-inflicted wound in the name of an issue that has, of course, that is openly debated. I have to be careful what I say because the eye of Susan is over me. But all of that being said, it does show that China is willing to use the same sort of policy or the same form of diplomacy over climate, but at least in a way that secures its own interest. And that is something that I think definitely needs to be focused on. And if you wish to mirror the Chinese in that policy, then nuclear needs to be incorporated in that. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that happen out of this current regime of the West. Oops, hold on. The first question was from Jack. He says, if American hegemony goes, does inter-European war become likely? I don't know if it would be hot conflict, but I definitely would see political ones and strained ones over leadership. I do think that, if American hegemony were to stop keeping the, European fabric together, so to speak, and even now we're kind of seeing that bubble up, right? When Merkel was in office, the conversation over the discussion over, say, European Union leadership or the European Union army. You always saw Merkel and Macron go back and forth about, who wants to amp up the rhetoric the most over the European Union. And then during Brexit, France played a significant role in making that very difficult to leave the European Union, which sort of sent a chilling effect and message to various other Eurosceptical parties throughout Western Europe that, hey, maybe this isn't worth the idea. All of which, of course, is an issue. But, the fact that France is a nuclear-armed state would probably definitely sort of level the playing field. The UK would probably be interested in continental affairs once more because it's also a nuclear-capable state, not to mention Russia's right there. The balance of power would play a significant role here because things are a lot more different since the concert of Europe. So, I mean, things to keep in mind. Let's see. The 136 then also asks, China has also invested a lot in thorium and fusion research. Why does the West hate nuclear? It makes no sense. Well, special interests. Democracies are often oriented around generating promises to get people to the polls, shortening the time span, but also not doing anything whilst in office. So notice how Biden's, certain policies from its various bills that it has passed in Congress or its environmental focus is always about starting the year after it leaves office or something like that. So, it always inherits the next problem for the next administration. As to why the West hates nuclear, keep in mind that there's also been massive amounts of fear-mongering, whether it's 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, or most infamously Chernobyl. These things do play a role there, but I do think that a smart government, a rational government, one that would actually lead and serve its citizens would include massive amounts of nuclear investment. But yeah, like we're saying, all of these issues are in mind as well. So things that we have to keep in focus as China begins to move towards, greater investment in that region. But I mean, let's see what's happening. There's also various forms of investment from other countries as well. I think France is the largest nuclear-based power. Most of their energy comes from that. I know they have ITER, which I think researches nuclear fusion. I don't know how involved the United States is, but those are all things that would have to keep in mind as well. But the only context in which when we talk about nuclear weapons, right, is that you've had nuclear armed states fight each other, like India and Pakistan, but they have direct line communication, just like we do with the Russians and the Chinese, in order to mitigate and decrease the use of just the likelihood of actual use of discharge of nuclear weapons. Because the position I've held is that you don't have just a strategic discharge of one or two. I think once you decide to turn the key, you've invited the rest of the world to do the same. But I think the reason why, again, it kind of goes back to the nuclear energy thing, is that even if you say it's for diplomatic and, meeting energy needs that are clean, any nuclear armed state is going to raise an eyebrow when you start seeing the proliferation of any kind of fissile material anywhere in the world. So as we wrap up this lecture, I think that the best way, right, is to say that, one, the increase of vaccine diplomacy and the use of Belt and Road and Asian infrastructure investment banks has allowed China to put significant amount of interests within the South American region that already has some animosity towards the United States politically and historically. Two, the fact that it has allowed itself to have such a great extraction commodity market with these countries, particularly with lithium, which is vital to its own security interests, shows that China is willing to meet some kind of economic and strategic parity to the current Western paradigm, where we currently rely on lithium as well. All of these things are definitely things to keep in mind. All of these things have definitely been put in place. And then finally, of course, the use of climate and vaccine diplomacy allows you to further entrench your goals, especially when you've seen economic downturns take place over the course of lockdowns and other, restrictions in the last 2 years about reduced capacity, reduced consumer spending, and reduced consumer confidence. This has allowed China to flood its money. This has allowed itself to put it, all in a place where it can increase its political advantage in the region, while at the same time working with governments that are more friendly towards China and more friendly towards greater economic and social cooperation, such as CELAC over the Organization of American States. So those would be my final thoughts, and I think that this trend is going to continue. I do think that any regime that comes next, as well as the current administration, would need to open its eyes and realize that something needs to be done either for rapprochement or integration. But at the current place where we stand, China does have the economic advantage and the political advantage to maintain a steady relationship just south of the United States' backyard in a way that will benefit it economically, strategically, and politically for decades to come. So that would be the end of today's lecture. And now we can get to the announcements and, of course, everyone's favorite part, the Frog of the Week. So, of course, the art contest is still going on. So if you haven't sent an email or a Twitter DM with your submission, you have till the end of the month. As much as I like sort of the sunglasses Edmund Burke, I would like something a little more reflective that I think is of myself, whether it's the fishing, whether it's the frogs, whether it's the IR talk. By all means, my channel email is available. And if you're wanting to give it a go for it. I would really like to see everyone's artwork. And I would also like to foster community. I know that everyone's here for Frog of the Week, but I like to have more with you guys. I like chatting with you all. You guys bring ideas that give me ways to think, and I greatly appreciate it. I have a very high IQ audience. You guys are fantastic. Keep at it. Let's stick with it. And of course, there's a prize with it as well. It'll be 100 USD right out of my pocket into yours in various forms that you would like it. So if you're open to having a US $100 being sent via crypto or however, just let me know and we'll figure it out. But you do have until the end of the month. So that's being said, on to the regular channel announcements. So this Tuesday, there's going to be a Substack article on digital escapism. I had a really great conversation with Frody last Saturday about the idea that we come out to the, we go on our online spaces and then we don't do much IRL, or we just create these communities that bring this bubble in. So it gave me a lot of thoughts to keep in mind. So we'll be talking about digital escapism and things such as that matter this Tuesday. And then Virilio's discussion of the original accident is coming to Odyssey this week as well. So I do have an Odyssey channel. All of my YouTube stuff is backed up on there as well. It's in the link tree description. So keep that in mind. And I'm continuing to work on the first part of the Her review, just giving my overall thoughts on the film and some of the things that I really observed, just because I find it to be, in 2021, when we watched it with our patrons community night, which if you are a patron on Subscribestar, or a channel member on YouTube, you do get access to the community nights and the gaming days and things like that. So we watched Her a couple weeks back. It was a lot of fun. And then I recorded a real talk yesterday that'll premiere this Thursday. I'm going to upload it for the mega upload link, so all of my wonderful patrons and channel members can see it a few days early to tonight. So you guys are in for that. And then later this week on the 20th, I will be over at Lambda's channel and we'll be talking about asceticism, Christianity, the scripture, and what various church fathers have said. So Lambda's a fantastic guy. I'm really excited for that one. But yeah, plenty of stuff in the works, and you guys are always here for it. And as Minoan says very honestly, he's just here for the lecture. Well, Minoan, that warms my heart. This sort of stuff has always been something I'm interested in ever since I bought George Freeman's The Next 100 Years in 2009. So you guys are fantastic. I'm very thankful. But yeah, so let's get on to everybody's favorite part. And I love how the viewer count increased as soon as we talk about Frog of the Week. All right, so our wonderful Frog of the Week actually doesn't have a name. It is one of the several species of the Telmato bufo frog. There are 3 species that are endemic to the southern Chile within its mountainous corridor that goes all the way down to the coast. And they are known as false toads. They are not actual toads. They are frogs that are simply evolved as toads to look like them. They're listed as an endangered species primarily due to habitat loss and river siltation, because it affects not only the pH balance of the water, but as well as their access to various forms of algae in which their young feed on. So their spawn are usually found in fast-flowing streams or areas of high-flowing water, allowing them to feed on algae and various other small, plant aspects. All these things allow you to put themselves out there and grow, but they are listed. All 3 of them are listed as an endangered species. And with that, the Chilean government is trying their best to preserve them. And in fact, believe it or not, when it came to that CELAC discussion with China, they were talking about habitat and environmental preservation of various indigenous flora and fauna within their countries. So we might actually just see Chinese money being used to preserve these 3 species of false toad frogs that exist down there. They also don't have a name, and they have been have a significant amount of limited research. And in fact, for this frog, the Telmato bufo, which I'm going to call them that because that's sort of the genus name. They don't have an actual name for them yet. And in fact, they're very rare and hard to find. During various expeditions, they've only found a couple of males and a few areas where they spawn. So limited information. So maybe if they do preserve them, we can get more info out of them and someone can come up with a really great name. But their rarity does make it difficult for research and also classification because they were originally listed under a different species before they came out with their own definition and gave them the name that they have here. So this, of course, is one of the many frogs in South and Central America. This was unique to Chile, which I thought would be very on the nose and very prudent to discuss for today's conversation. But that, ladies and gents, is our Frog of the Week. And that happens every Sunday right here. So no matter how dry, dour, or doomer it can feel with these lectures, we always can end it on a strong, good, and nice novelty. So I'll just catch up with you guys and take any questions that you might have for a little bit. Again, thank you to my top tier patrons who donate $20 or more or a month on Subscribestar. You guys are fantastic and keep it all going. As I've said already, if you're new to the channel, all of this money I don't keep in my pockets. You guys make sure that I don't pay any out-of-pocket costs for my anti-rejection medication. So you guys make my life a hell of a lot easier, and I'm very thankful for that. But there is also merch in the links down below at the link tree. So there's a Frog of the Week mug, and our good friend Dora does all of the merch work for the art. So if you aren't following him on Twitter at Dora the Stormer or follow us on Telegram, then you guys are missing out. He's a fantastic artist. But let's see here. Let's see how's everyone's doing. Melphis999 says, some global stuff for you to ponder. Finland is going to become a NATO nation soon, ruining our good relations since 1950 for the sake of the pause if Crimea fails. Interesting. I didn't know that Finland was planning on becoming a NATO member. I thought that Scandinavia had been relatively independent from that. They had their own capacity to not be. I'll have to definitely follow that as well. So yeah, of course, I didn't know, but yeah, I'll have to take a look at that. I've been following a channel who is based in the Scandinavian area, and I believe he's in Finland, actually, if I recall correctly. Someone had sent me a really good lecture of his, A Walrus. Yeah, he's in Norway, not Finland. But he did a recent conversation about Norwegian politics and what it's like in Scandinavia. So he's someone to follow. He's A Walrus. You should find him. He did a really good lecture on the failure of conservatives and libertarians in the West. Highly recommend that you follow him. He's a good guy. But they're thinking about membership. Oh, and then Steve says they're talking about membership. I don't think it's finalized yet. Interesting. So, I don't know. I wonder though if that means that Sweden and Norway are to follow. I'm something I'm definitely going to have to keep in mind. But let's see here. Let's see. Monothalmo says Finland is economically tied to Russia more than most EU members. If anyone were to leave the EU, they're a candidate. But I mean, Germany's also closely tied with them. And that's the push and pull that I think you and I were talking about earlier. Mono was the issue of pursuing economic interests over the ongoing strategic balances and alliances here, because it does come at a cost, right? Not only for your citizenry, but your ability to conduct your own independent foreign policy. Something, that Turkey has also been having to struggle with. Melphis says you should try and get in touch with the Jolly Heretic who AA knows and lives in Finland. Professor Dutton is just. I love his streams. They're very keynote because I get to learn something that he all strings together with his understanding of stuff. And I love the costume bit that he does at the beginning. I quite enjoy that. But I mean, I don't know what I would talk to him about unless he's familiar with some of the domestic politics there, or the foreign relations stuff. I don't know what I could really offer him. I'm not too sure. But yeah, I mean, I can do that. I can ask. If I follow him on Twitter, I could just add him and ask. But yeah, something to keep in mind. Let's see. Chat's going all over the place. You guys are great. Thank you for engaging. I was about to say Dutton doesn't really do politics. Yeah, that's something I wouldn't really add. Let's see here. Mongolian Doggerland says that Caspian report worried me too. A lot hinges on Sweden not being a member of NATO and having less than half as many soldiers as it's got subscribers. I mean, I've always considered Scandinavia relatively independent from NATO affairs. I mean, I know that they have communication and coordination with them, but I mean, they have their own issues when it comes to, say, Russian submarines or Russian flights flying over. These are things to definitely keep in mind. So this will definitely be something that I'll follow. Thank you for bringing this to my attention because, yeah, I mean, I could probably talk to Frody about it too and see what he knows. But no, this is all good information. This is things for me to look up and read on because when you're reading books and checking on the news, sometimes things slip through. So yeah. Like the Geneva talks, for instance, Secretary of State Blinken and the Secretary General of NATO had said that they do intend to plan to have Ukraine be admitted into NATO, which only escalates the current situation, which is how you got Lavrov talking about places like Venezuela and Cuba being for Russian deployment. So things are very tense and they're escalating. Fraser says Sweden sent troops to patrol the island of Gotland in response to Russians mounting a presence there. Yep. I know that they've been some of the largest, voices when it comes to Russian advancement or what they would call like Russian planes flying overhead. So I can't say that I'm surprised at all there. Let's see here. So Scandinavia is not independent. It's just a cope from us living here. Sweden is also wanting to join NATO now that Mr. Evil Butler himself had a submarine get close to Gotland. Well, that's good to know. So I guess then, Melphis, if you want to shoot me a DM or comment somewhere on this video giving some more information, I'd appreciate it. That way I can give myself a good head on my shoulders and figure out how to read into this. But like I said, I'll ask the few Scandinavian fellows I know, and I'll send a message to Frody and see what he could tell me as well. And I might even just shoot a message to Marcus because he's Norwegian. So yeah, all the things to keep in mind. This is why I love our network. It's just an international band of merry right-wing people. Tuesday says it's a midterm year now. Gotta go vote or go vote. The only election I'm particularly interested in covering, to be perfectly honest, is the French election. If I can find enough nice French people that are willing to come on and talk to my Yankee ass, then maybe we'll have a French election stream like we did with the Germans. So who knows? And yeah, I know that Denmark and Norway are NATO members, but and it's the Swedish and the Finns that I'm more curious about now, considering that they're not technically members, but they're adjacent and don't mind it. But again, all the more reason for what's the word I'm looking for? To get Walrus on, because I'm curious about Norway and their position with NATO here. Let's see here. Okay. Tuesday asks a question. Do you think if things get weird in Turkey sometime soon, George W. Biden will do Iraq things? No. I don't think so. In part because Turkey is in a weird position where it's engaging Russia, both in the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict. It's providing drones to the Ukrainians. As much as they don't like Erdogan, you don't. So, okay, you go in, you sack him, you do nation building, or even if you just try and get him rid of via color revolution, the question becomes, what happens then to, say, the 4.5 million migrants that Erdogan keeps threatening to release into Europe? You're creating, I think, an even larger humanitarian crisis if you do it. Jules Roy says, just tuning in. Finland's foreign minister said on Friday they are not negotiating to join NATO. We'll see that. Good, we can clear it up. Awesome. Let's see. The Duran is covering the French election on them, so go check it out. And I believe the election is set in April, and I know that of course it's a two-rounded election, so there'll be another one. Tom Nguyen asks, would I allow George Freeman to run the United States? No, I don't think I would allow any think tank foreign policy people to run the U.S. except maybe the realists. Herlock Sholmes says, Prue, can you tell us more about the movie club? Yes. So if you would like to become a wonderful channel member down below, all you got to do is hit the join button. You'll get access to cute little frog emojis and things like that, but also you'll get access to a Discord link where I coordinate movie times and share memes with my patrons. And what they and we once a month we try and schedule a game night or a movie night, so we can watch films, and I plan to review them as well. So, for instance, a couple weeks ago, not this last Saturday, but the Saturday beforehand. No, it was last Saturday, actually. My patrons and I, we watched the 1941 film Sergeant York. I definitely want to, I definitely want to review that one. We watched the movie Her, which was just Bugman dystopia. But yeah, we pick films and things like that, and we want to just talk about various ways in which we can review them. I like hearing everyone's thoughts. It's a nice way to connect with them. We've also played in the past in Halo and other games as well for those who wish to do that. So if you're interested, by all means, you can subscribe for as little as just, I believe, $2, and you can, not only keep me afloat, but you can also enjoy great movies and game days. So that's all down below via the subscribe star, link in the description, and the link tree as well. There are plenty of great ways to just have a good time and have community days and things like that. But again, all of those community nights and such go all the way back to things that you'll see. So we will see movie reviews on here. We will see, things that are I might just use gaming footage as a backdrop while I talk about something unscripted. So there's all sorts of stuff for us to use. But yeah, all the more benefits of enjoying Frog of the Week. You get access to videos early and things like that. But yeah, after hearing everyone talk about sort of the, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, that's definitely going to be an area of interest that I'm going to cover. And now I'm just going to definitely send a message to Mr. Walrus and figure out more. But until next time, there will be a Real Talk out this week. I'll be over on Lambda's channel this week, and there will be a Substack post out this week. And then hopefully some Odyssey exclusive stuff if my schedule permits. It's been a very busy couple of weeks. So yeah, plenty of things going on. You guys are all fantastic. I will see you all next time. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, whether it's the morning, whether it's the evening, or whether it's night. I'll see you all next time, and be prudent.